Over the past couple of weeks, we've been looking at our church's new vision statement, which is this: as we follow Jesus daily, we will intentionally take risks to bravely live outward. And over the last couple of weeks, we've looked at the idea and we've explored what it means to follow Jesus daily. And we've looked at what it means to bravely live outward. And so today I want to look at the middle part, that part that talks about intentionally taking risks. What do we mean by that? What are we hoping to accomplish? What is God calling us to when we're talking about intentionally taking risks? But let me back up. Let me ask you this question. What was a risk that you have taken in your life? Think back over your life, no matter how long or short it is. What is a risk you have taken? I mean, maybe it was trying out for a team that you were unsure that you would make. You didn't know. Maybe it was sliding into the DM of that cute girl or cute boy and asking them out on a date. Or maybe it was leaving home to go to school halfway across the country. Or maybe it was starting a business or switching jobs or maybe even switching careers. What is a risk you have been willing to take? Or maybe it's not as big as that. Maybe it's a little bit smaller. You see, one of the risks I've taken in my life happened at the end of my second year of university. You see, I allowed one of my dorm mates to talk me into going tree planting with him for the summer. And I had a good painting job. I had painted for a couple of years. I was making decent money at it, but the allure of making a lot of money tree planted outweighed that. And so I said yes to my friend, and I went up to northern BC to plant trees. You see, what was promised as a sweet gig soon turned into a nightmare for me. There was a number of things, but one of the hardest probably was the weather. Even though it was May, it snowed. And here I am in my Coleman tent with my sleeping bag that is rated to -20. But at night, I would crawl into my sleeping bag. I would put on 2 pairs of socks, wool socks. I would put on shorts and sweatpants. I would have a shirt and a sweatshirt on. I would have a toque on. I would wear my gloves, and I would zip up my sleeping bag so only my face, my nose, and my mouth stood out. That's all that was exposed to the air. And I knew that by the morning, there would be ice crystals in my nose. And this is the prayer I would pray as I was falling asleep. Jesus, please don't let me have to go to the bathroom during the night. Because you don't want to get up when it's that cold. Just step outside your tent, right? And so there was that aspect. But there was another aspect too that I found difficult, and it was the actual tree planting itself. You see, the ground that we were given often was on the side of a mountain. So it was like hiking up the side of a mountain. And instead of nice soil, we were often given really rocky ground. And if you've never tree planted, you have to realize that in order to make a lot of money tree planting, you have to plant a lot of trees because you get paid per tree. And so there is this rhythm that you get into planting a tree. And so you have your shovel. And here, I got a picture of it. This is actually my shovel. I still have it from when I was tree planting, over almost 30 years ago. And you see, it's about waist height. It has that D handle on the top. So you put your planting hand on the shovel, and as you're walking, you take a step and you, with your planting hand, drive the shovel into the ground. And you see the shovel has a fairly weighted blade on it, even though it's narrow. And you drive it into the ground, and then you pull it back, opening a hole in the ground. And with your right hand, my right hand, that's because this is how I planted, I would take a tree out of my planting bag, bend down, put it in, take the shovel out, and then I would stamp on it a couple of times to close the hole and keep the tree there. And then you'd be on to the next one. Now you can see that this breaks down, this nice rhythm of planting a tree breaks down when you go to stick the shovel in the ground and what you hit is a rock. Because your shovel doesn't go in. There's no hole to open. And worse, your hand just starts vibrating. And what you end up having to do is stopping your rhythm, getting out of that rhythm, moving your foot to your shovel and pounding your foot down on your shovel, trying to open a hole so that you can put your tree in. And then you've got to try and close that hole. And it's a lot harder if there's a bunch of rocks as opposed to just nice soil, right? And so it got so bad because the ground was so rocky most of the time that I would wake up in the morning with what is known as the claw. You see, my hand would freeze in the form of carrying the shovel. And I would actually have to take my other hand in the morning when I wake up and peel my fingers back in order to create the flexibility. I couldn't actually move my frozen hand because I had the claw. And so with all these things going on, I soon began to despise tree planting. No wonder why, right? But I had made a commitment to be there the entire spring plant season. And there was this little minor fact that we were in the middle of nowhere in northern BC and I had no transportation. So even if I wanted to leave, I couldn't leave, but I was going to stick it out. And so this is how I tried to cope. Every night I would write a letter to a different friend. And I would write this letter and I'd address it to them and I'd explain what was going on. And in it, I would say, I hate tree planting. I hate tree planting. I hate tree planting. And then at the end, when I was about to close the letter off, I would say this: do me a favor. When you receive this letter, after you read it, do not throw it out. Keep it. And if I ever come to you and think and talk to you about having an idea about going back tree planting, whip out this letter and show it to me and remind me of how much I despised tree planting. And it was a good thing. My last week of tree planting, I was switched crews and I was put on with the more experienced crews. And so I got to plant where they were planting. And let me tell you, I learned a secret about tree planting. They give the experienced crews the best land to plant in. Like, for example, in half a day of planting with the experienced crew on their land, I planted more trees in that half day than I had the entire previous week. Because you could just get into that rhythm and plant and go and run and plant and go. And at the end of that day, I realized why some of these guys were planting, because you could make a lot of money if you got onto the experienced crew and planted. And so what the secret was is you usually got on the experienced crew on the second year of planting. That risk, I stood out, took a risk, and it was terrible for me. It really was. You see, when we have experiences where we take risks and it doesn't actually play out for us, one of the downsides of that is we can become afraid to take even more risks because our experience teaches us that we shouldn't do it, that there is negative consequences for taking risks. And so oftentimes, if we have enough bad experiences, what happens is that we get into this play it safe mindset. And for me, that play it safe mindset was just stick with painting, Brent. Stick with painting. Don't go back to tree planting. You see, for each one of us, our risk tolerance is different. And our risk tolerance is sometimes affected by our personality. Sometimes it's affected by our experience. Sometimes it's affected by our life stage. Because generally, when we have kids, we take less financial risk because we got someone to provide for now, someone to take care of. The older we get, generally, we tend to become more conservative in our risk taking. Sometimes that's financial. Sometimes that's with making big life decisions or choices. And yet here's the conundrum of life, I think. Most of the worthwhile things in our life, if we take the time to sit down and examine it, always have this element of risk. The starting up of your business that is now successful. The asking out of that girl who you married. The deciding to have kids even though you didn't know if you could afford it or if you were going to be a good mom or dad, and now you got 2 or 3, or in my case, 4. The taking up of a new hobby that you didn't know or if you had the skill set. If we're honest enough, I think the exciting things in our life, our exciting memories, are the ones when we take a risk, go on that trip, go out with those people, do those things. And if we evaluate the people around us and the people we admire, generally the people we admire, if you look at their lives, are the people who have taken risks and not let failure stop them. You see, history doesn't remember those who play it safe. The history books that you read don't highlight all the people who played it safe, do they? They highlight the people who took a step and took a risk. And sometimes it highlights those who fail spectacularly, and sometimes it highlights those who succeed. But they all took risks. Let me give you an example. I'm going to give you a list of names and just see if you know any of them. Let me read them for you. Have you ever heard these names? Shammua, Shaphat, Igal, Pati, Gadiel, Gadai, Amiel, Sethur, Nabil, and Guyo. Heard any of those guys? And they're all men, by the way. If you maybe were counting, you realize that I just list off 10 names. To give you a perspective, a context, those 10 names are usually associated with a list of 12 names. Let me give you the last two names, Caleb and Joshua. Now, many of you are probably knowing where this is going because you recognize those two names. You see, when I add those two names, you know that I am talking about the 12 men that Moses sent in to the promised land to take a look at what it looked like. For those of you unfamiliar with the story, let me just kind of give you the Cole's Notes version. You see, the Israelites had been in slavery in Egypt for a little over 400 years, and through a series of miracles, God causes them to be released from their slavery, and He brings them to the land of Israel, or what would be the land of Israel. The land that He had promised to Abraham and his descendants over 400 years earlier. And so they arrive and they're wondering what this land looks like because there's no one alive in the Israelites who had ever seen this land. And so, of course, they send in these men to take a look, and they realize that the land is not empty. There are people who are there. And this story is found in Numbers chapter 13. And so I just want to start by reading the first couple of verses. So verse 1 says this, "The Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders." And so at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran. All of them were leaders of the Israelites. Verses 4 to 16 goes through the names of the men who were sent. And then verses 17 to 25 tells us what they explored. And we find out that they're more than explorers. They're actually spies. Because they're checking out the cities, if they're walled or not. They're looking for how hard will it be to conquer these people. And they spend 40 days roaming the land, and then they come back, and you get to verse 26. And they come and they give their report. And this is what they said. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. They reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They brought it back with them. They gave Moses this account. "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there," which means they were like giants. "The Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea along the Jordan." The report is this: the land is amazing. But there are lots of people, and they are very well established. And they are very big people, scary people. And out of that report come two responses. The first response is given by Caleb, and it's verse 30, and he says this: "Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, 'We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it.'" You see, he sees this scenario, he sees everything, and what's his mindset? He has a risk mindset. He says, he looks and he sees the possibilities of what could be. And he says, we got to go for it. But then there's the second response, and this is found in verse 31 and on. "But the men who had gone up with him said, 'We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are.' And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. They said, 'The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there were of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them.'" You see, they take the same situation that Caleb saw. And instead of applying a risk mindset to it, they apply a safety mindset to it. And all they see is the problems. and they don't see a way around the problems. And so what ends up happening is these 10 guys, because it's not Joshua, as we find out later, these 10 leaders turn the people against Moses, against Aaron. And even though Joshua and Caleb plead with the people, they don't listen. Listen to what Joshua and Caleb say to them. And in verse 7 of chapter 14, it says, "And said to the entire Israelite assembly, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." They take a risk mindset, and yet they can't seem to overcome the safety mindset that the other spies convince the people of Israel with. And if you know the story, you know this, that the people do not listen to Caleb or Joshua. In fact, they refuse to go into the land, and it has serious consequences for them. The 10 spies who led the people into not going into the land, we find out later in chapter 14, they all die because of a plague. And then all the adults who refuse to go into the land, God sends them back into the desert. And for 40 years, they wander the desert until the very last one of them passes away. And it's not until they're all gone, that generation has died, and only Moses is left, and only Joshua and Caleb are left, and their kids, that they come back to the promised land, ready to go in to the promised land. You see, it's only Joshua and Caleb of the 12 spies that will have the privilege of actually entering in and doing what God had called them to do. So what can we take away from this story when we think about us as a church with a vision of intentionally taking risks? I think there's 2 big points and a number of smaller points. The first major point is this: it is never truly a risk if the Lord is with us. It's never truly a risk if God is calling us into something. If he is leading us somewhere, even though we don't know where it is exactly where we're going, if we don't even know what the next step is beyond the one we're taking, if we don't know even what the outcome is, as long as God is calling us into it, it is not a risk for us. It's a call to faith. You see, when we talk about intentionally taking risks, it is always paired to the first part of our vision statement, which is, as we follow Jesus daily. Which means that we don't just take risks for risk's sake. But as we're following Jesus, as we are going where Jesus is leading us, we are going to be intentional in stepping out into the unknown. We're going to be intentional in taking those risks, being willing to do things that we're not comfortable with, but we know and we can be secure in the knowledge that we are doing what God is calling us to do. You see, it is never truly a risk when the Lord is with us. And then you add the last part of our vision statement, which is to bravely live outward, which gives us another qualifier and direction in terms of the risks we should be taking. The risks we want to be taking are the ones that help us live outward. The ones that where we're intentionally doing things that will allow us to live the mission that God has given us as a church, to love him and change this world one life at a time. You see, what it means is that when we have decisions to make and choices to make, the decisions we should err towards or lean into are the ones that help us turn outward, live outward, not the ones that help us to be inward focused. We need to be outward focused. This word intentionally take risks means a couple of things to us. First, it means that in being intentional in the risks that we are taking, we will actually evaluate the choices we are making. But it also means that we are going to build into our plans opportunity to take risks. In fact, even now, when our staff gets together to plan things, to look ahead, and to think about what God wants us to do, one of the questions we are now always asking in our planning session is this: where's the risk? What's the risk? Like, where can we step beyond where we are comfortable in what we're going to do? And so part of this mindset of intentionally taking risks and understanding that it's never truly a risk when God is with us, when Jesus is pointing us in the right direction, is we have to get to the point where we are actually willing to try new things. And sometimes that means we have to be willing to let go of the established things. And this is actually hard for me as the lead pastor. You see, because of my personality, because of the way I view the world, my first answer usually to a new suggestion is no. You see, I have a gift. And my gift is the ability to see every way your idea or your proposal could possibly fail. I know all the ways it won't succeed before I even start looking at the ways it can succeed. You see, I start with no and then wait for you to convince me to turn it into a yes. Intentionally taking risks, that's not a good mindset. In fact, I've come to a place where I have to realize that I have to actually start with yes. Not no, but yes. And as we talk it through, it may become a no as we talk through a number of different scenarios. But it's a very different way of approaching new ideas, approaching new ways of doing things. And to be honest, I find it hard because it's not my natural bent. My natural bent is to say no and let you convince me to turn it to a yes. And so that is one of the things I'm wrestling with as we go through this new vision and these new changes. Start with yes. And maybe you're like me. You need to evaluate your life and realize you're not taking the risks God wants you to take, and you need to step into those risks. And maybe it starts with a change of a mindset where you actually say, okay, I'm going to say yes until it becomes a no, as opposed to saying no until it becomes a yes. I think there's another aspect when we talk about being intentional in taking these risks as a church or even as people, is that we have to be willing to persevere. We have to have this mindset that we are not going to let failure stop us. Even though things get hard or difficult, if we believe God is calling us in a certain direction or calling us to accomplish certain things, we have to get past the obstacles. We have to be able to keep trying, even if it doesn't work out the first time. You see, this leads me into the second main point, I think, that Caleb teaches us and Joshua teaches us about risk. And it's this: safe is the enemy of risk and therefore the enemy of faith. See, all 12 spies were leaders. I don't know if you caught that, but all 12 of them were men who were respected in their tribes, in the nation. They were leaders. That's why they were chosen, because the people would listen to them. But only 2 of the 12 actually wanted to step into the risk. They were the only leaders willing to take a chance, willing to step out. The rest, they weren't. And sometimes as I look at leading and how hard it can be sometimes, and there's different aspects of leading, and sometimes there's leading, sometimes there's managing, and I wonder sometimes that often we slip into a managing mindset, which is needed in organizations. But managing mindsets, usually what they're focused on is cutting down on risk, right? They're trying to protect the assets. They're trying to make sure the revenue streams are maintained. They want to actually keep the status quo if it is going well. But leadership is about moving into the future. Leadership is taking a step into the unknown. In leadership, there is always an element of risk. And so if God is calling us into these areas of risk, we need to be brave enough, we need to be courageous enough to be willing to step into these areas of risk. And to be able to do that, we actually have to have the willingness to try something and be okay if it fails. Because not everything we do is going to be successful. God doesn't guarantee that 100% of the things we're going to try are going to always work out like we want them to. Ryan Leake has written a book called Chasing Failure. And the premise of the book is really this idea that he wants to help people not to be afraid of failing. And his premise goes to this place where he believes that a lot of people don't actually do the things they should be doing, even the things God calls them to do, because they are so afraid of failing. And he gives an example. One of his heroes is Kobe Bryant, the superstar basketball player who played for the Lakers. Kobe won several championships, is in the Hall of Fame, was probably one of the best players of the game. And he had a chance to meet Kobe and talk to him. And then in his book, he quotes part of Kobe's book, which is the Mamba mentality. Kobe's nickname was the Mamba. And Kobe writes this, because one of the things that most people don't realize about Kobe Bryant is this. He is the record holder in the NBA for the most missed shots. You see, Kobe wasn't afraid to take the shot. And this is what Kobe says, I wasn't scared of missing, looking bad, or being embarrassed. That's because I kept the end result, the long game in my mind. I always focused on the fact that I had to try something to get it. And once I got it, I would just have another tool in my arsenal. If the price was a lot of work and a few missed shots, I was okay with that. You see, I don't think Caleb was under any illusion that conquering the land was going to be a walk in the park. I think in fact, he knew he was going to lose people in the fighting, that he might lose family members, that he himself might even die. But the goal of taking the land, the goal of realizing the promise of God for the Israelite nation was way more important to him, and he was willing to bet his life on that. He was willing to step out and take the risk that he believed God was calling them to take. We need to have that same kind of mindset. And yet we've added one more layer at the church here. You see, we want to step out and try new things. We have to have a willingness to try even though we fail. But we've also got this other kind of statement we've come up with. We will fail, but we will not suck. Meaning that whatever we step into, whatever risk we take, we will put our full effort into it. We will try hard. And it's not necessarily about the end result. It's about the effort we put in, realizing that in order to get to places that God wants us to go, sometimes he takes us through learning times, sometimes he takes us through things that are not as successful as we would like them to be. And so in our willingness to try new things, in our willingness to risk, in our willingness to step into those moments, we have to also be willing to fail. But when we fail, we're not going to suck. We're going to fail well, right? We're going to do everything we can to do that well. You see, our church is 25 years old. And I think for a 25-year-old church, there is a temptation to be really comfortable, especially since our church has had some degree of success. There is a temptation and a pull to play things safely. But we can't get to that place. Because ultimately, if you continue down that road, I believe that as a church, we'll end up dying. We need to be at a place where we are continually taking risks. In fact, we want to basically enter the land of what if. I've been watching Marvel over the last number of weeks. They have this new series out that looks at their well-known movies and their well-known stories and asks this question: what if something else happened? And they take these scenarios and play them out. And in many ways, I think that's the attitude we need to take to church and our life. And constantly ask the question, what if? What if I do this? What if I do this instead of that? What if I go and do that sort of thing? What if? What if we make a different choice? What if we make choices where we don't actually know what the outcomes are? You see, COVID has forced us to do a number of different things, including one of the key things that we have always done through our over the last at least 20 years. I don't know if you realize it, but it's been 2 years since we have run a soccer camp. Something that has defined our church in the past. We haven't been able to do it. And here's the thing, I'm asking the questions right now, like the what if question. What if we never run another soccer camp? What if we do things entirely differently? What if we step out and take a risk and get out of our comfort zone? What if soccer camp's time has passed? Now, I don't have an answer for sure on that, and there's still a lot of discussion that needs to take place, but what if? Those are the type of questions we need to be asking ourselves. What if there's some way better to reach our community than soccer camp? What if there's something better out there that we could do that would actually help us bravely live outward? I think it's also a good reminder that our vision statement starts with "as we." You see, the "as we" is both a personal and a corporate language. And we did that intentionally. As a church, we want to do this, but as a church, we will never do this if the people in our church aren't doing this. And so this message is really a message to you to examine your life. And as you follow Jesus daily, are there things he is calling you into that require risk, that require you to move out of a safety mindset into a risk mindset, that require you to do something different than what you're doing? And whenever we're in that moment, I know that there's fear. I know that we have to give up comfort. I know that there are things that we have to give up that we really like sometimes to step into that thing that God is calling us into. Let me pull you back to Caleb. Caleb is actually quite an amazing man. I don't know if you know his full story. I think he's only mentioned in the Bible in like 30 verses. And we've just covered a chunk of them. You see, Caleb is ready to go into the land. And so after 40 years of being in the desert, in the wilderness, he still has that same drive. He still has that same belief that this is what God is calling them to do. And so he is one of the leaders that leads the nation of Israel into the promised land. And in Joshua chapter 15, it tells us that Caleb is given a section of the land around Hebron. And Hebron, it tells us, is where these giants live. And at 85 years old, Caleb leads his family and takes his piece of the land, conquering the people that are there. He defeats the giants. Did you catch that? He was 85 years old. Apparently, he wasn't ready to retire. Apparently, he wasn't ready to let his kids do all the work. Apparently, he wasn't content to live on stories that were 40 years old. He wanted to be living in that moment. And you might be listening to this and be at an age where you are starting to rationalize the things in your life that you've done enough. I don't need to do that. I've done my time. I don't need to do that. The kids can do it. The next generation can do that. But let me leave you with this. If you are still alive, that means God isn't finished with you yet. He always has more for you. Even if it takes you longer, even if you're slower at it, if you're alive, God still has more for you. So my encouragement to you is be intentional. Take a risk this week. Do something that you would not normally do as you follow Jesus daily. And then we'll see where God will take our church when all of us are doing that. Let me pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for today. Lord, I thank you for this challenge of intentionally taking risks that is part of our vision. Lord, it is a challenge to me. And I know I struggle sometimes with even my own mindset of how I approach things. So God, I pray for myself that you would give me a risk mindset, knowing that when you are leading me and leading the church and leading others, that at the end of the day, it's not really risk. It just means we don't know what lies ahead, but you do. And so God, help us to become a church that intentionally takes risks as we follow you so that our community can come to know you, so that we always keep that end goal in mind, that we are doing this because of you so that we can change this world one life at a time. Lord, we thank you in your Son's name. Amen.